All right, welcome to the second webinar in our three-part series on Java and regulatory compliance, what you need to know. Today, we'll be focusing on securing Java for the Emea regulatory compliance. There we go. Sorry about that, trying to advance the slides. My name is Dana Crane. I'm the Product Marketing Director here at Azul, and I'm joined today by Simon Taylor, who is our SVP and Head of Global Channels and Alliances. Say hello, Simon.
Hey Dana, good to be here and looking forward to the conversation today.
All right. So a couple of housekeeping things we should be aware of. There will be a recording of this video made available to everybody who registered, and we're going to save some time at the end for Q&A. So on your Zoom client down at the bottom there, you should see a Q&A panel. Just pop that open and put any questions you have along the way in there, and we'll save some time at the end so we can get to those. To start off, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to talk today. So key concerns that we've heard from prospects, from customers around compliance, and especially when they move from Oracle to an OpenJDK solution, how does compliance work? And then we'll talk a little bit about the regulatory landscape that we see in Emea, the kinds of regulations that are really top of mind right now in Emea. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Azul advantage and how you might be able to actually get better compliance by moving to an OpenJDK solution like Azul. But first off, let's talk a little bit about some Oracle Java concerns that we've been hearing from prospects and customers. And this all started a couple of years ago when Oracle introduced a new pricing metric based on their employee count. So that was supposed to be a simple way to do pricing. You just count up the employees and that's how much you owed. But according to Oracle, employee is a very broad term. It can include students at universities, it can include your janitorial staff, it can include temporary workers, and even consultants. And that means for many companies, many large companies, they're suddenly being hit with a multi-million-dollar increase in license fees. And all that is coming at a time when Oracle started to drop support for many of their legacy technologies, the latest being JavaFX. So a little earlier this year, we did a survey. We went out and asked a bunch of companies, a bunch of enterprises who have very large Java estates, what they felt about when it came to OpenJDK. And what we found was that 88% of the respondents were more than willing to make the move from Oracle to OpenJDK. And that's really a result of all of the negative impacts they're feeling about Oracle's recent changes. And the way that that's panned out is we get questions. We get a lot of questions from prospects and customers. When they try to move away from Oracle, they really start wondering about, can I really make this change? Is it really as simple as just swapping out Oracle for Azul? And the answer is yes. That's because we test all of our OpenJDK builds against Oracle's Technology Compatibility Kit, their TCK. And that's in order to ensure compatibility. There's over 150,000 tests that we run against to make sure that anything that Oracle can do, we can do just as well. Now, there are some extremely rare corner cases, some legacy applications that might require a little bit more jumping through the hoops, but to date, we have had a 100% success rate converting all Oracle users over to Azul. Now, when it comes to compliance, that's obviously a different question, right? Those kind of questions always revolve around industry regulations, things to do with security, things to do with patching, availability, incident response, and many other issues. Now, there are a bunch of factors here, but most of these always come down to these most common requirements across both industry and government regulations. And let's talk a little bit about what that means for Emea. For Emea specifically, what we've seen is that businesses are facing much stricter cybersecurity and data privacy rules in 2025 than ever before. And that is really a result of, according to Verizon's 2025 data breach investigation report, it's really due to the fact that breaches in Emea have doubled over the past year. And that's really coming as a result of vulnerability exploits. There are a lot of bad actors who are using AI these days to automatically probe for vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities that have yet to be patched, and then exploiting them. And that's happening at a time when regulatory fragmentation is becoming a really key issue. You've got discrepancies between EU requirements and UK requirements that just don't align. And as a result, what we see is that compliance costs just keep rising. You get organizations now facing a trade-off between making business investments versus spending money on the technology to help reduce compliance risk. And that's really the key core of things that we're seeing right now in EMEA. But to dig in a little further, I'm going to turn things over to Simon, and he's going to go through a few of the specific regulations. So Simon?
Thanks very much, Dana. So now we're just going to touch on some of the, what I would deem regulatory landscape, particularly around certain specific types of regulation, financial services, general public sector, particular critical infrastructure industries as well, and really what the implication is on not managing certain aspects of data and the implications you can have as an overall business. Because, whilst at Azul here, we're not governance and compliance experts by any means. One of the things that we deal with a lot, and Daniel was referencing, is the fact that we help our customers manage their security issues in relation to posture of applications and also how they detect vulnerabilities and therefore improve their overall responsiveness, which is pretty critical, and you'll see why in a second. So first of all, let's talk about DORA. So I think a lot of people may be aware of DORA now. DORA stands for Digital Operational Resiliency Act. Came into effect sort of a year or so ago. What's interesting, though, and not many people know about this, is despite the fact that it focuses on things like maintaining security posture and really process and governance around effective management of security systems and things that relate to management as well. One of the things that you're probably not aware of is earlier this year, in fact, early last year, I should say, they started to firm up some of the requirements around reporting. So that means that when you have an incident, you actually have to report it fairly quickly. So one of the things that DORA sort of stipulates and is that if you have a particular incident that affects data, you have almost 24 hours for an initial notification to disclose the fact that there is an affection occurred. Then you have 72 hours after that to improve it with some additional reporting on the scope of that particular breach and implication. And then you only have 1 month after that to come up with effective reporting strategy for an overall real true understanding in the industry around what the implication is of that particular act. Now, of course, with anything, there are major implications around fines for non-compliance. So, for example, if you ignore it, then you can get up to 2% annual turnover or 1% daily turnover compliance issues and fines under this act. It's probably one of the most stringent acts for cybersecurity on the planet. In another earlier webinar, we talked about some of the implications of the US acts on cyber resiliency. It's nowhere near as firm as DORA is in terms of overall reporting and notification and then the implication. So the bottom line is, if in relation to Java, for example, if you are not patching your systems, then essentially you could put yourself at breach of the overall act in general, because there is a posture aspect of the act that says you must patch and you must maintain secure and accurate systems. But then even if you do have a breach, the issue is to find where it is and patch it and update it as critically as possible to minimize the implication on both timing, reporting, but also potential penalties as well. Another good act is NIS2, which is sort of enhanced cybersecurity across EU. Now, this has much more of a broader directive on things like governance and management. A lot of people are aware of NIS2. It's been around for some time now, but it includes things like early warning indications, the 24-hour period, again, the 72 hours we just talked about with DORA. But it's much more of a general security directive. So there's a lot more implication around what is best practice, what is good governance, what is good risk management procedure in relation to how you can manage this type of in your environment. The one probably I'm always focused on a lot, though, is GDPR. And GDPR, just generally, I happen to know a lot about this from a data protection point of view. But there are implications to breaches. So again, if you've got 72-hour reporting window, breaches potentially can be both personal data, citizen data, but organizational data as well. And here the implications are more significant, because where you might think, oh, well, I'm not in the industry that stands for sort of critical infrastructure or things that relate to sort of DORA and how I would deal with that, and you think you've got a particular out in this respect, when you're governed by GDPR, it's any type of interaction you have with public data that you have an implication as it relates to GDPR. So that 1 hour response window plus the 72-hour breach window plus then the remediation window and then potential fines are considerably higher. I mean, again, you could get situations where you're up to 2% of total annual revenue, 1% again. So it's worth looking at these and thinking about what your requirements are, what the requirements are in terms of managing and protecting data, how you need to notify, and then in turn what you need to do in a situation where you have a breach, and how you can really triage that quickly, incident response time, minimizing the overall window in which you're exposed, for sure. And the final piece of legislation I really wanted to talk about was PCI, because in the financial services sector, this is a very specific piece of requirement that mandates that both the core organization and the supply chain are governed by the same standards. So, for example, if you're a bank and you're outsourcing third-party PCI transaction management to a particular organization, or you're dealing with somebody that does ATM management, or for example, and that's where some of the transaction, for instance, if you're withdrawing your money because you've gone on holiday and you're trying to withdraw money from an ATM in another country, that type of transaction, depending on the local legislation, is governed by PCI DSS standards as well. So the implication here is it's not just the primary organization, it's the whole collective supply chain that is again governed by both breach, incident response, and posture-based approaches as well. So this is again critical, financial services dependent, but you have 48 hours in this scenario to be able to notify of an incident, and then the compliance requirements around mitigating that breach, particularly if it's 0-day, for example, could be pretty significant if you don't actually manage that effectively and don't actually protect your systems. And the final one is the EU Cybersecurity Act, sort of related to the NIS directive in general, just because of the nature of the act. But it also has very specific requirements. For instance, 10 million euros or 2% of company liability if you fail to comply. That's an administrative fine. But sort of what I like about this is it sort of varies a little bit in terms of the industry you're in, how you approach it. I mean, the cyber resiliency side of things is sort of more of a generic thing. However, in the EU Cyber Resilience Act, which is basically the original governing framework, that has particular industry requirements that differ. So, for instance, 50 million, I said, if you're in a particular industry that focuses on digital products, for example, there are other requirements in other industries as well. So in summary, and I'll hand back to Dana very shortly, is let's just focus on what this overall means as a sort of summary requirement. So I always like to think that notification is king, right? So, and it sort of is. I mean, you could have the best penetration testing, the best resiliency program, the best risk management framework, the best governance strategy around security. But if you don't patch systems and you don't manage those systems effectively, in many instances across Europe, you're out of compliance almost immediately. The fact that if you have a system that's governed by DORA, GDPR, NIS, or EU cyber resiliency, then you have a challenge. And what that means is that if you have a particular breach, whether you have a scope of unsupported systems or not, the clock's ticking. You have a very limited amount of time to get your act together. So whether you're compliant or non-compliant, you have to manage the scope of breach. You have to have time to remediation. You have to report that. That reputation issue then that occurs off that failure can affect your brand. It can affect your market share. It can forget people's trust in you. I mean, some of the examples that Dana mentioned earlier, where we talked about Marks and Spencer's, for example, that's probably fundamentally affected their brand for many years. Will people go online and start buying products from them again, or will they turn to another retailer that has a better security strategy? And then a failure, again, never mind the reputational cost, which could be fairly significant. There are particular fines and regulations in the EU that maybe don't exist in other countries because it's more guidelines. So, for example, in an earlier one of these webinars, we talked about Essentials 8 in Australia. That was a colleague of mine, Simon, as well. And Essentials 8 is a guideline framework. It's not mandatory, but a lot of people follow Essential 8s, but it doesn't have as much teeth as things like DORA and GDPR do have in Europe. So really, the regulatory landscape for getting your act together and managing the posture of your applications is pretty critical in Europe. Now, with that, let's just focus a little bit on Azul as an advantage, and I'll just picture one thing first, and then I'll hand back over to Dana to carry on the conversation. If we pick on that thread of incident reporting and what that means, many companies today have a very, very bad strategy for patch management. And in the open source community, that's never more prevalent than it is in the Java world. For organizations that rely on OpenJDK, that means free OpenJDK solutions that get distributed every quarter. Many of those solutions have tens of thousands of modifications in them, some of which introduce new issues from a security point of view that didn't exist before. So as people go and update their Java versions, their Java runtimes with the new OpenJDK versions, they're inadvertently introducing security issues that weren't there before, or maybe some got patched this time that were there last time, and so on. Very few people actually go through a lot of detailed testing on these patches, or what they do is they don't actually update them at all, and they wait until the next patch, which is another quarter away, which could be up to 6 weeks, 6 months away, before they implement the patch to make sure that the previous update actually didn't introduce anything that was critical. Now, in all that meantime, you've got systems that are exposed. And the average time to exploit right now on any sort of OpenJDK is 22 days. And that's because of the OpenJDK process. And of course, the remediation is slightly longer because you have to wait for the next open source update. So what does this mean in reality? It means that you're in a regulated industry that's governed by DORA, GDPR, NIS, EU cyber acts. You have to have a better strategy around patch management than relying on open source updates. That pretty much means you need to work with a solution or a vendor that is actually giving you what's called critical patch updates. And Dana will talk a little bit more about that right now.
Great. See if we can advance the slide. There we go. So yeah, thanks, Simon. So Simon mentioned something about critical patch updates. These are one of the key things that we can help you with. Critical patch updates are security-focused updates. They maybe have typically around 10 to 20, maybe 15 different changes between quarters. And that makes them very easy to test and very quick to deploy to patch any of those outstanding vulnerabilities that have been discovered. Now, what Simon was referring to is the publicly available open source patches, what we typically call a patch set update. Those are also released on a quarterly basis, but they can contain hundreds of different changes. They can contain new features, they can contain bug fixes, in addition to security fixes as well. Testing them, you should be rigorously testing them, can take time, and that means your systems go unpatched. And again, this is a time when AI is being used to probe for known vulnerabilities. So, as the last slide said, we've got timing being of the essence. The mean time to exploit has gone from 22 days back in 2019 to as little as 20 minutes last year. So time is of the essence when known vulnerabilities get exposed to the public, happens on a quarterly basis. Critical patch updates, very fast to put into production, very easy to shut down those things. Patch set updates, not so much, especially when historically 1 in 4 patch set updates contains a regression issue, which means you're going to have to roll it back if it actually affects your systems. And that can mean you're waiting up to 90 days for a new patch. Well, usually not 90 days, sometimes a couple of weeks before a new patch is issued to close that bug that's affecting your systems. Again, that means your systems are sitting exposed for a couple of weeks, waiting for that open source patch to be patched. With us, a CPU, we've never seen a regression issue to date. Out of cycle patches, another great one. When you think about things like 0-day vulnerabilities, how do you address those? Well, if you're taking the open source approach, you don't get an out of cycle patch. You're going to be waiting up to 90 days for a quarterly patch before you can plug that hole. Again, Oracle and Azul, the only two that issue out of cycle patches on a regular basis to make sure you're secure. And when it comes to global technical support, we've got the largest Java set of Java experts outside of Oracle that can support you 24/7, 365 around the globe. One of the other key things we provide is backported fixes for Java 6 and 7. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but if you're running something like a PCI DSS system and you're processing credit cards using some of these legacy technologies, PCI DSS mandates that you must provide commercial support. We are, I believe, the only Java OpenJDK vendor and only Java vendor, since Oracle no longer supports them, that can provide you with that kind of commercial support. And finally, production support for things like applets, JWS. I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Again, Oracle no longer supports it, but we do. So all this stuff is great, but if you can't take advantage of it because you don't have the time and resources to devote to patching on a regular basis, we've got certified partners that can help you. Our extensive network is here to take the ball and run with it if you can't devote the time and effort or the scheduling to be able to implement these things to keep your system secure. All right, let's talk a little bit about a specific piece, and that is around patching. So vulnerabilities and patching, what we typically see about here is this governance gap around, I know that things are bad, but I don't know where they're located and I can't patch them in time. And that's because, key reason here is you're devoting more and more of your resources to investigating these alerts. These AppSec tools that are common out there today are investigating things at the sort of Java library level. They're finding out that, yeah, there's a lot of vulnerabilities present, but they don't quite understand the fact that in production, that vulnerable code is actually not getting loaded and used. That's where Azul comes in. We have a product called the Azul Vulnerability Detection, and that looks specifically at production code, and it's looking at the Java class level. So it's able to discern if a vulnerability is actually not only present, but actually used. And that is happening at production time. We're not looking at non-production code like most AppSec tools. So as a result, we can reduce all that alert fatigue. We can take away 99% plus of all those false positives that typical AppSec tools are throwing. And that means you can devote more time and resources to actually doing the remediation versus doing that investigation. So I mentioned at the top a little bit about Java 6 and 7. So we still see this deployed fairly commonly, especially in banks, where Java 6 and 7 are still present. Now, Java 6 and 7 are no longer supported by Oracle. So those systems are very vulnerable. You continue to see vulnerabilities being introduced that still affect Java 6 and 7. And we are one of the only companies that backports fixes from each quarterly release to address those Java 6 and Java 7 vulnerabilities. That means you can make those older systems compliant and miss out on all those fines that you might get for being out of compliance around using these kinds of older technologies. Another older technology we commonly see is things like Java Web Start and Java Applets. And those are sort of desktop legacy applications that can be really problematic because when you try and move away from Oracle, finding commercial solutions for these kinds of problems can be very tricky. Now, we have a history of helping people via our open source solutions to find solutions for their existing Java Web Start applications and Java Applet implementations. So, a good example is a customer of ours that had to turn off security alerts for thousands of desktops. And all these alerts would go off on a weekly basis whenever their regular scan ran. Now, we were able to move them from Oracle to Azul using some of our open source solutions so they could move off of Java Web Start and Java Applets, replace them with ours. And now, weekly, those alarms no longer go off. That allowed them to establish compliance, and they gain commercial support for those applications along the way at the same time. So finally, I'll make one last comment around security, and that is our recent team-ups with a pair of hardened container providers. Now, hardened containers have really come of age these days. Excuse me. And if you're connected with, if you're concerned at all with the security of these containers in which your applications are deployed, and you should be, you can now deploy Azul's commercially supported solutions for Java with chain guards, non-CVE containers. They build them nightly from upstream sources to ensure minimal vulnerabilities. Or you can deploy them with rapid forts near zero CVE containers. And that allows you to minimize your application's attack surface while also minimizing the need for patching and remediation. So with that, I'm going to open it up to Q&A, see if we've got some questions here. So I see one of them in the chat already. Organizations rely heavily on vendors. What are the responsibilities of third-party vendors under regulations like DORA versus the responsibilities of the end user organization? Simon, do you want to wait?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So what's interesting is that a lot of third-party vendors provide effectively an open source version of Java with their application that is shipped with when you deploy it.
I think Simon may have just frozen here for a second.
What happens is a lot of organizations try and get security patches from people like Oracle, for example. Now, Oracle has some major implications, because if you download a security patch update for, say, Java 17 onwards, well, just recently that changed, but for Java 17 onwards as well, then or below, I should say, then you are paying for that security update. You may not realize that you've got to pay for it, but you have to. So in many cases, you would have to go back and subscribe and pay Oracle a license for those security updates. That's also what we do at Azul. We supply security updates for Java 6, 7, 8, onwards through to 17, 20, 22, 24 right now, so that we protect those runtime environments. But we do it in a way that's significantly cheaper, right? And also it gives you those most important, those critical patch updates. So great question, but you can't rely on a third-party application provider to give you security patch updates for your Java runtime. They might do it for their own code, which is just sort of embedded security posture or capability in the way the application is constructed, but not for the runtime environment. Dana, is there anything you want to add to that?
I think you covered it. That's great. See if we have anything. Looks like we don't have any more questions at this time. So I'm going to call that a wrap for now. And I would encourage you guys to check us out on the web. If you've got other things that you'd like to check out, you can find us at azul.com/resources. We'll make this webinar available there. And of course, the rest of the versions in our current webinar series around compliance as well. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and have a great day.